So yeah.
All right, we're recording. Welcome to the podcast, Howard. It's super nice to have you. I've been since last time we spoke, I've been really intrigued in with the ideas that you've been bringing up, and I just wanted to pick your brain about some stuff today. So, if you want to just introduce yourself to the listeners, a little bit of your background, and yeah, we can just start with that.
Right. Well, let's see my background. I got interested in the psyche early on. When I was a kid, I used to have these out of body experiences. I thought, I was kind of felt like I was
Uh,
expanding my body, and I didn't understand it. And I was an athlete. I was playing hockey, and it was pretty much, kind of an unusual thing. And
yeah.
so it was from, I think, from being, about 10, 12 years of playing hockey, being embodied, really fully embodied, and playing a sport that it was probably, well, it is the fastest team sport in the world, was ice hockey. And you had to really
Mm,
know where everybody was, and you had to really be centered. It was kind of like a martial art in the sense that you're skating from your center, from the danchan, from that place, and right in the center of your being. That's the place that gets developed, when you're skating, if
mm,
you're doing it the right way. And I was taught by some good people. So I started off being very grounded in the body, and then these strange things were happening, So I started getting interesting in psi phenomena, in transpersonal psychology, and I got my degree in it, bachelor's degree in that at Northeastern Illinois University when I was living in Chicago. And then I did my master's degree in humanistic psychology, and I got into research, but human science research from the continental philosophy of Europe, Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, and the human sciences, phenomenology,
mm,
hermeneutics, types of things.
yeah.
And they were more qualitative, descriptive research, the stuff that William James is doing when he was doing radical empirical studies. It's right at the source of psychology, was describing experience as it was being lived, and I got interested in that and found out that there was a method to that you could do methodological scientific research, studying qualitative data. So I got really into that. And then I kind of got into quantitatives afterwards. So it was interesting. I did like the cart before the horse. It
Yeah.
really, it was the cart after the horse, because it all started from experience, and then science, as we know it, the natural sciences started to focus on things in the world, and measuring things, got fascinated with that, and it took one step away from the human sciences, but that got to
Mm,
be the science of preference, because in a way they thought that our experience was deceiving us. It was
yeah.
very clear to people that that the sun was moving around the earth. I mean, you couldn't deny it. But now we're locked into a position that we actually would not deny that the earth is moving around the sun, and we know that for sure now, which is just another paradigm we're in. So that's just to show you how the way we're sure about the sun being the center and us moving around the sun is probably how people felt when they saw the sun moving around the earth. They were
Yeah.
very sure,
Yeah.
measurements and everything.
Absolutely.
So got into the description is has to be deep, and if it goes deep, you can get something out of it, but you can't just take it for granted, because appearances can be deceiving. So that was one of the reasons for going into the human sciences and going in to validate experiences in a deeper way. So I did that research and the comparison between natural science and the human sciences, and developed a little research institute down in Georgia for the school there. We did like an interdisciplinary human science research institute.
Mm,
Then I came out here. I left the research institute for some PhD people, because I had my master's, and then I came out to San Francisco to do my PhD out here at California Institute of Integral Studies, and got into a whole different thing. I got into studying shamanism, as an ancient, the first healer, the first artist, the first seer, the first psychic, the first healer. I think I may have said that already. So the shaman had like a multi-function in this community. So I got into studying that a little bit, and I also met somebody because I wanted to have some experiential part to my theoretical studies, and
Yeah.
and so I met Curandero, who's like a healer that works with the spiritual dimension or the soul dimension. And he was working with a lot of the students at integral studies when I was studying there in '86 through to about '96, 2000. And I kind of started working with him and experiencing the medicine work he did. And then I started helping him and learning all the different phases of the work that he did. And it's kind of like an apprenticeship that that took place over a 10-year period. Then I
Mm.
did my dissertation and got to do some work as an adjunct faculty at Noetic Sciences when we were trying to develop an inter-organizational consortium for human science research. And then I went into art and just got into the field of art for about 4 or 5 years, took classes and got like an undergraduate degree in art, and started getting into that whole field and selling art and painting. And then I got back into the medicine work because the whole field started opening up with MAPS doing all the research. And at my school, there was a group that started up there. And the Psychedelic Society started, so there was a lot of interest being renewed because of the studies that was coming back in MAPS
Yeah.
for looking at how psychedelics affected healing. And they were doing some rigorous research then. And
Mm.
Michael Pollan came in the scene about 3 years ago, and so I've been running groups now for over 2 years with the in affiliation with the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. And I have two folks that we run the group together with, a woman, Damla and Sonia, and we've been running the group for 2 years. Last year we've been doing it online through the meetup. But I've been doing a lot of research on the side and working with developing some models, of how to bring together some of the Jungian psychology and shamanism, and looking at some models for collective awakening. I call it lucid awakening.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I am right now.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff for sure. A couple things that were coming up as you were speaking about that was you were talking about like the paradigm, like the right now our paradigm is that like the sun is at the center, and then kind of we're making these distinctions between social sciences and the quantitative sciences. And I'm really curious about this. You mentioned there's this idea in science that like our senses deceive us, like we can't trust our experience, it deceives us sometimes, it doesn't show us the full picture. And from what it sounds like, and from what I'm hearing with some of the work you're doing, is like in a sense some fields are flipping that on its head, and it's like our experience is the most real thing, and then the idea of the quantitative objective thing that we're being deceived from is like the thing that is deceiving us, if that makes sense. And it's like trusting the experience first, and then the rationality, rather than there's this objective world that I'm being deceived by my experience. Did that land how did that land with you?
Yeah, that's one angle on it. And one of the things that the human sciences does is it when it says it goes deep into the human experience, it doesn't mean that it's an individual case study. What they do is that if you're situated in one part of like on a Zoom right now, you're situated in one part of the country and I'm situated now, so we have two perspectives on whatever we're talking about. So the perspective helps us because we could look up and we'll see. Now right now it's a different time probably where you are than where I am, so the
Yeah.
sun is in a different relationship to the horizon,
Yeah. Yeah.
where now we could sit together because there's two of us now. We could say, well, wait a minute, now I'm looking at it from one place and you're looking at it from that place. Something is different, so we could start to make sense of it. We go into our experience, and I could measure, but I can also tell you what I see, and you could tell me what you see. So in other words, it's not just an individual information you're trying to get at, but you're trying to get a consensus. So there's a way that you find out more about something, but the more people that have perspective on it. So it's
Mm.
kind of like in a way, it gets validated by if the essence of the theme that you're studying holds up when many people are looking at the sun moving. You can get the best map that way by having a lot of viewpoints on it. So it's a collective project in a sense as well, by what is validity in human science research, as opposed to just one person deciding it for someone else. So it's a collaborative kind of method in a sense.
Mm.
Um, you know, the, um, if a bunch of people are standing around, they see an event happen, like we could use what happened last week when the Capitol was, you know, um, attacked. You see,
Yeah.
the more information that comes through, the fuller the picture gets to be from the different angles and the different people that saw it from inside, from outside, as people were entering, as people were breaking the outer perimeter. You start to get a picture of the whole, of the greater whole. And that, in a sense, is constructing a model from not specialists, but from people that were there and with a different perspective. So you could start to build a model from that. So that's one way the human science is consensual. It's kind of like a coming together to build a fuller understanding together of an
Mhm.
experience.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating, fascinating. Um, yeah. I guess we could dive right into some stuff that we kind of planned out beforehand too. I would love to dive into you said you mentioned maps and there's all these amazing psychedelic research studies that are really enlightening us on a lot of different things that we didn't know before, or it's just really proving some of the things that we kind of thought were true, but it's just giving us some data behind it. And some of that is around the some of the research that it sounds like you're really into right now is the soldier suicide side of things,
Yeah,
and we're potentially using some sort of psychedelic research to with PTSD and that type of stuff. I'd love you to riff on that and to explain some of the ideas that you've been working with in the last few years.
yeah. Let's see. I'll start this way. I was looking at what's the essential structure of the sacred initiation experience, and that's kind of what I was working with when I was working with Pablo with the medicine work for the 10 years. And I saw that one of the things that happens in the psychedelic experience that's beneficial is there's an ego softening or an ego dissolution that occurs. And when that happens, it kind of activates a deeper self archetype to emerge. Okay. And that archetype is able to experience how things are interconnected, kind of that there's relational connection between yourself and nature, yourself and others, yourself and memories of ancestors, of people that
Mhm.
that brought you up. Let's say
Yeah.
um, you have a relationship to the plant world and exchange oxygen and nitrogen. Kind of that way. There's
Yeah.
interaction there, and that we have relationships with animals. Some animals are our pets, some animals we eat. I mean, this is like a radical interconnectedness. And that archetype that comes forward in the initiation experience shows you all these interconnections that you have with the world. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's an ego dissolution, and there's an awareness of a radical interconnectedness that you have with all layers and realms. And I was looking at that, as one of the essential pieces of the initiation ordeal, that it's like a sacred remembering, let's say. And I compared that to, I asked the question, why are 22 soldiers on the average every day committing suicide? That have post-traumatic stress disorder. There was something about that that was really strange to me. And I thought about it, and I know how they were saying, well, the soldiers come in with trauma, to the military, or they'll say that the deployments, being redeployed 5 or 6 times will cause trauma. But I said, it's funny because nobody's mentioning basic training as one of the primary possible sources for what they call moral injury. That's how they're calling it now, for what
Yeah.
happens to soldiers. And I thought about that, and since it was kind of like it was interesting how that part of the whole ordeal was being left out, the basic training, which was pretty rigorous. And then I looked at basic training, and I started to talk to people. I was not in the military myself. um, I kind of looked at playing hockey for 10 years as a way to get that whole thing out of my system. It was aggressive enough for me. So I didn't need any more aggression. So I went into looking at basic training. If when I watched videos of how they um, how they indoctrinated folks, basically is what it is, and how they put them through these ordeals. I started to see that what they're doing is in a way a sense of initiation, but it wasn't a sacred initiation. It was an initiation that was meant to kind of insert a dualism into their consciousness. They broke their egos down in the same sense that a medicine would do, and they brought them down to a baseline. And in that vulnerable, broken down state where their ego was open, they inserted a dualism, and they retrained them. Um, they rebuilt them with this dualism inserted, and the dualism was looked like a friend or foe, and you had to instinctively respond in the correct way to that. Otherwise, your life was in danger, or perhaps your whole platoon was in danger.
Yeah.
And so it was a type of thing that the sacred initiation was looking at how everything was interconnected. And what I'm calling the profane, or in Iliad's terms, he's saying profane is incomplete. So it's incomplete in that it's separate, it's divided, it's dualistic. The dualism that was inserted in the psyche had an effect on people, because they would be having not a ego death experience out in the field, but they would have a literal be having their lives at stake. It was a literal death encounter. Sometimes it was over and over again with multiple deployments. And these traumas or shocks were happening on top of this dualism that was inserted into their psyche at the time they were most vulnerable and broken down in basic training. And I looked at the suicide issue, and I said, one part of themselves is making a decision to try and annihilate something in them that was too horrific for them to live with. So they decided to kill that. In a way, it was almost like they were operating on their own dualism that was inserted into their psyche to try and annihilate that one side of the killer that was put into them, in order that they could survive without this incredible anxiety and guilt for whatever that split was put in. It was incurred, and then whatever was on top of that they experienced in their military service.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I thought, they were trying to somehow resolve that dualism, because they definitely had a very heavy ego dissolution experience. It was not just a metaphorical ego death, but it was literal ego death. It was literal death. And then on top of that dualism, I thought this is a formula that might be going into having these soldiers trying to alleviate themselves from this split that was put in their psyche by committing suicide as the final solution. And I thought that's pretty amazing. So my thinking was to present this at a conference I was invited to present at about 4 or 5 years ago over at Sonoma State, and I presented this idea. And basically, I concluded after I gave the talk, they said people have got to get exercised, because in a way it was a form of sorcery done to their psyche in basic training in order to insert this dualism in them so permanently and so thoroughly. And
Mm.
people came up to me afterwards and they were saying, I've never heard it explained that way, but it made sense to them. I had put 4 or 5 people talking with me afterwards, and somehow the understanding of what was done to them helped them with that feeling of something alien, something split off in them, something unknown. Maybe it gave them a clue. So in a way, this was a way to show how what they're doing a lot of cognitive therapy right now with soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder, and I thought this is a deep form of cognitive reframing in a way by helping them see what was done to them when they were in a most vulnerable situation in basic training, that somehow if you worked with that split and with the trauma that happened on top of inserting that split when they were deployed, the split is put in basic training, is relatively safe. It's a somewhat contained situation where they're doing the sorcery, let's say. And that it might, if they understood what was done and had a sense of the dynamic of it, that they might be able to make sense of it and then work themselves out of it by healing that split, rather than have to literally try to kill part of themselves or to do some kind of annihilation in order to get at that split, and that was my idea. So that's some of the work I'm doing now. I'm trying to find some receptive group that wants to work with this and see if it might be helpful. And you could do a comparison, people that are getting regular cognitive therapy and doing the psychedelic research for the post-traumatic stress, and you could do a control thing where you could do a group that was also getting this specific cognitive therapy to understand it in the form of a splitting that was inserted to them as the original moral injury in basic training, and see if there's a difference between the groups. So that's what I would like to do.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. As you were speaking, I was really getting this sense of this, like, this is really profound in the soldier setting, but it almost sounds like the implications could be much further reaching as well. It sounds like something that, like, could, to help us understand the psyche and to help us understand almost mental illness as a whole, right? Like, this is, it sounds like this could be common for a lot of people, the splitting, whether it occurs in this initiation process and basic training, or whether it occurs at some other point in their life for some other reason. It sounds like this basic splitting is something that's very common in our culture, especially as we're becoming more isolated and separated and all this stuff.
Yep, very good. That's how research should go. Taking one idea and building another idea that's even more generalizable and testing it. Because you're absolutely right, Ethan. Because if it's true in that particular situation, then you could make a more general claim and work out a theory to test. Is splitting like that just a natural tendency, which it is, as a defense mechanism against trauma in general, when someone's a child and they can't really digest and interpret cognitively, they don't have the capacity yet. So a baby or yet very young child will do a splitting like that naturally as a defense against cognitive dissonance, because they can't digest the information yet. So they have to protect one part of themselves from the damage that's being done, and they split it off and it goes into the unconscious. And just the general enculturation process itself does that to people. You've got to fit in. You can't use you can't use the id instinct. You have to kind of
Yeah.
control yourself, fit into the culture, sit down in school for 15 years without moving, for 6 hours. All these things that are taken for granted as being good for you, they have some benefit. Let's face it, there is some benefit for doing some kind of structuring your life, and being able to concentrate. But they also have a tendency to kind of throw people into splitting off parts of themselves and that gets to be part of the psyche, that stays in there, and that's some of the stuff that comes up when the medicine work is done. What occurs is, as soon as that ego is softened up and it starts to dissolve a little bit and open, um, what emerges first is anything that's in the shadow. In the shadow being things that were relegated out of consciousness for whatever reason. They were either too bad to want to remember, or too powerful to want to remember, or not something you thought was important, so you forgot it. Painful. It could have even been good things that you remembered. Because they weren't in your repertoire that you needed for whatever your intention was in. But whatever's in the shadow would come up, and have to be dealt with, in the medicine work. So to incorporate all these things, and there's good things in the shadow as well as bad things in the shadow. There's a lot of gems and potentials. Like people sometimes are reluctant to get into things that they're good at, even, and that are their strengths, because they overwhelm you, so that they get relegated to the shadow. You know. So the shadow contains a lot of little diamonds, but it also contains a lot of little pieces of pain, and things that were also dissociated from, because that's the best the psyche could do at the time for staying intact. So it splits off things that are too overwhelming, or are too complex for the state of development that the child was at.
Yeah, yeah. It's like the shadow is not, it's not like you purposely like repress all these things. It's just like that's what your sense of self, your ego does to stay alive. It's like the survival mechanisms, the defense mechanisms against all this pain that's coming up, and like to be able to cope with some of the stuff, right? And I'm getting the sense of like this initiation process. It's almost like it's a cultural initiation too. Like everyone in our culture goes through this sort of initiation process into like separation and dualism, and
Separation.
yeah, and separation.
You offered a lot of profane structures, like you go to school, that's an initiation in a
Yeah.
sense, and you go to school, you go to work, you get married. These are all rituals that initiate you into the next stage of life. A lot of them, though, are based on materialism and competition and hierarchical things. They're not necessarily based in qualities of soul. That
Yeah.
they're usually competition. Where we very much value the individual. The individualism in this culture. It's a
Mm.
fight to the finish. The survival of the strongest. And these are ideas that the culture feeds us. Make America great again, is another one. So these things they have implicit hierarchy. They have implicit kind of ambition nature to it. um I remember Rajneesh was, when I was in India. Before I came into doing my master's degree, I went to India for a few months, and Rajneesh used to say, the only extraordinary thing that exists is someone that's ordinary. And that gets to be that you're exactly who you are, where you are, without all this ambition. Like Krishnamurti would say, ambition is the source of all our problems. We're trying to be something other than what we are.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, start to look at how we're being pushed into a certain form. You know, a lot of it is driven by consumerism, and
Yeah.
how capitalism makes you give the soul away. There's a lot of pieces to soul loss. If you start to look at all the little chipping away at the soul of the child.
Yeah.
And through adulthood, that you stay on the treadmill and you're doing it for the fans, or you're doing it for the family, you're doing it for freedom, democracy. There's all these ideological goals in the future that keep you from being who you are in the present. and it takes a toll. It throws out stress hormones. It preoccupies you with ambition, and before you know it, your life moves beyond, the midterm, and then you start saying, this is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful wife. You kind of look at, you're driven to these things. It's kind of like in a flow of a cultural flow, and you wonder where your soul is.
Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, what you said right there is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is like, as we I sense a lot more and more people getting frustrated with this because it's always searching for something more. And I kind of started to wake up to this a little bit a few years ago. I was like, why I get all these goals, I have them, then I achieve them. And then as soon as I achieve them, there's one, it's like, it's the never ending, the ever receding benchmark or the ever receding finish line, and you never get there. And I'm sensing like, yeah, more and more of us are kind of realizing that, and it's becoming really frustrating. Like, damn, like I'm kind of realizing that I'm just never reaching this the goal that I'm chasing, and I'm always chasing more goals, and that what's hard is it's what replaces that, and it's like I don't think there's not very many options in our society of like to all right, you realize that, and then now where do I go? Like I don't know how to replace that, just like ever receding, like consumeristic, materialistic void that's kind of like encompassing us because we're never okay wherever we're at right now. And I would love to dive into this from the perspective of initiation and ceremony. Because we were talking about, yeah, cultural initiation, the boot camp. It's kind of like this breaking down, this deconstruction, this separation into dualism. And it sounds like these shamanic ceremonial they also break down the ego and then they rebuild it into something more interconnected, more unified, more it sounds like you have a bit of expertise on that. I'd love you to riff a little bit on like our culture brings us up into this separate dualistic materialistic world, and then is the psychedelic ceremony, the shamanic ceremony, one where we break down these dualisms and then rebuild it back and integrate it into more unified senses of self and stuff like that, or whatever's coming up in your mind. Yeah.
Let's see what I'm thinking. Let's just start from what we have. We used to be like an extended family. We used to have tribal,
Yeah.
small tribal, groups of maybe 100 people living together. And I
Mhm.
think that worked for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And then slowly we started developing more of the urban kind of way of being together. And then we had instead of the extended tribal family, it looked like more like the nuclear family. And then it was the absent father family, and then it was the absent parents family, because both parents had to go work to earn the same amount that the father did 30 years ago. This is recent now. And 30 years ago, we also started relegating the elders to institutions for care. And a lot of to the last few generations, the elders would live with the parents and the grandparents, and the children would all live in the same you know area of the same house, the same two flat maybe building.
Yeah.
But there was a familial feeling, and now, the young people move out right away as soon as they can. The grandparents are sent off to the institution, to the nursing home, the care center. Both parents are working, and the adolescent that's looking to morph into an adult is basically being raised by his peers usually. And then it depends on what the peers are like. If you're in a place where there's a baseball field across the street from you, where like I had, okay, then that's what you would do. You play baseball with all the kids in the neighborhood. But if it was a gang, or if it was something a little more devious, that's what you were exposed to, because there were no elders there, to guide you. The grandparents weren't there, the parents weren't there, so
Yeah.
you were basically on your own. So it was like his initiation was very much self-initiation without much support system. There was no community there. There was no extended family there. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We're at a place where everybody is an independent, individualized, focus on individualism without a context, without support system, without elders,
Yeah.
you could go ahead and buy a psychotherapist or go to a private school, maybe where you get some good teachers, but the public education system is left to fall apart and blamed. So you have a situation that people are on their own. They're driven even more, and drivenness by some type of anxiety in a way to reconnect with this lost ground that they've had, this lost context. But they're basically on their own seeking context. So that's a tough one to do, because everybody else is on there, feels like they're on their own too. So it's you've got a driven culture, and you drive so far that you start to realize that you're contaminating your own life space, and you're running out of resources, and so you get to the point where moving out and into the future it starts to collapse a bit, and that's where we're at right now. I think with this pandemic, we've reached out to the point where we've started to get into where the viruses from these bats in these caves are being affecting humans, and we're eating everything that moves, and expanding and cutting up forests and cutting the wood out of the forest and extracting the oil out of the ground of the forest. So we're basically destroying our own ground, our own context in a way, and it starts to have an effect,
Yeah.
back on us.
Yeah, absolutely. We're
That appropriate growth. What's optimal mean instead of maximizing? How can ritual, getting coming together in community, help us to remember, what the context is about, and the more that we start to be able to trust, that there's a way that we could get along with each other instead of having to compete with each other, and we start to trust a little bit more. We start to realize that we don't have to always be expanding out, that we could be
yeah.
weaving something in closer, and that's where some meaning lies that we need for soul building,
Mm,
something that's kind of in close, intimate, and just
yeah.
projecting into the future.
I'm sensing like this one of the models that we're both familiar with is like integral model or these developmental models. And one of the characteristics of those is it's like the spiral, it goes from the right to the left to the right to the left. In the right, it's being individualist, community, individual, community, individual. And I'm really sensing like I've heard many different references that the US is at like this individualistic stage orange, this very achievement oriented mindset. And so, yeah, inevitably the next step would be community, right? So I'm sensing, and I sense this a lot with a lot of the people that I talk to. Everyone's like, God, I just want to build a community. I just want to like, that's all I want to do in life is I just want to like build a community of conscious individuals who are like thinking the same way. I don't want to be like just constantly chasing it on my own. It's just, there's a lot of this need for community. And especially, yeah, and the ceremonies, I feel like those are kind of stepping in as a means for that community. And a lot of the people that I talk to are like, yeah, the ayahuasca ceremonies are like, yeah, it's the community, it's the grandfather figure is like the shaman that's helping. And yeah, where do you see
Yeah.
us go? What I would love you to explain a little bit, where do you see us going away from the individualism? Like what's next, or how would you define what you're kind of the transition you're seeing away from individualism and maybe some of the characteristics of what that looks like, or some things that you've seen talking to a bunch of these people and about this?
I discovered something that came out of the Jungian model, was Ettinger, and it was, he called it as the ego self axis, which is very interesting developmental model. And it was, the child has to develop an ego to separate from the womb and the experience of embeddedness with the mother and the family, the parental. They have to become an independent entity. So that's the ego development. But then there was usually an initiation process that happened, maybe 10 years old, 12 years old. And that was the time that the ego was suspended, set aside, and the child was introduced to the self archetype, which is the dynamic part of the ego that is larger than the individual. It's the self is the community. The self represents ancestor, the lineage, the genetic lineage, the connection to the community, the way the guide would help people to go through an initiation, that ego would be set aside so that a dynamic self archetype would emerge and take over. And that self was not just an addition onto the ego. That self archetype in the ego self axis, that self archetype represented the self that was part of the nature world, the self that was part of the ancestral connection that you have, to your lineage. The self was part of knowing how you are related to the plant world and interact with it, the animal world, the realm of the mineral world, all these parts of the earth, basically what exists on the earth. And the self was part of remembering the mystery of creation, where we all came out of a mystery, So the self was much bigger than just the ego, but that self was generated through an initiation process. And it was done after the person developed a strong sense of ego, who they were. Then they could set aside that sense to remember the larger self that they were. And that process was usually cared for by the elders of the community, and they had a narrative or a rite of passage ritual that they used to contain the narrative of the culture, the traditions that worked, and the myths that served the community. There was a narrative that was shared. And so you were introduced to this, beginning from the time you were a young person, and then by the time you were ready for initiation, you already had activated parts of yourself that were ready to be coming to the forefront. They were nurtured along, so that when by the time that you were brought into the ritual space, things were like revved up. They were like warming up the car. The engine was warm. So when you were thrown into the transpersonal experience, whether it was through a Sundance ceremony or through a medicine experience, that was initiating the adolescents as they moved into adulthood. You already had the engine warmed up, and you had the parts were all, everything was all tight and ready to go, so that you had a vessel, an engine to use to go into the transpersonal space and make meaning out of it, because there was a coherence between the community story, between what the elders were teaching you, between what you were experiencing in the medicine space and the initiation. So when you came back, the elders were there, the community was there. There was a place for you in the community already, because the community was intact. Now it's a very different thing. Initiation on your own is kind of an out of context. It's traumatic, when you go through processes without context and support.
Absolutely. Yeah, you were talking about how as these people used to go through this initiation process, first they would get a solid ego. And something that I'm seeing a lot, especially today, is like, and I even did this myself for many years, it's like sometimes before you have a strong ego, spirituality gets brought into it, and then it's really it's really like appealing because it's, oh, I can get rid of my ego, I can live a life of no self, I can transcend the ego. And for a lot of people who don't have a strong ego and they have a low self-esteem, they have like their ego is not very strong, that's very appealing. And I fell into that trap a lot, you know, where it's just, one of my favorite spiritual teachers, Ramaji, he talks about this idea of going from small, you have to go from small mind to big mind before you go to no mind, which is like you have to go from broken down ego to a well structured ego before you go to transcending the ego and no ego. And
Rajneesh used to say it like, in a way, he used to say that, someone was talking to him about surrendering their ego, as part of the sannyasana, part of the spiritual experience. And she didn't want to do that, and she said, why should I surrender my ego to you? What is this all about? And he would say, you've got to have only a ripe fruit falls off the tree. That if you surrender an ego before you have it balanced and healthy, that it's not going to do any good, because it has to first be in a balanced way. It has to grow to its fullest form. Then it'll fall off the tree naturally. So the idea that of the elders was they would watch the young people, and they would know just about. I mean, they've watched a lot of fruit, coming to becoming ripe, and they would know just about when it was the right time to initiate someone, because they would be ripe. They would be softened. They would be heavy, full sized, and not physically, but psychically, they were able to see it. So they would know when initiation is the correct time. But we don't have that kind of person around that much anymore that watches you throughout your development. If you're lucky, you find a teacher here and a teacher there,
yeah,
therapist here and a therapist there. The new shamans now are the therapists in a way, but someone that's watching as you're developing and actually contributing to that development knows when you're ripe, when the ego is ripe, and that's the time for the initiation. But it's therapy is an art form in a lot of ways.
oh,
It's
absolutely.
and it takes a certain sensitivity and a certain interest, that someone has in helping someone. So when they're initiated, they're able to even bypass them, so they're able to step out of the way once the initiation happens. And a lot of times teachers have a hard time stepping out of the way for their apprentice to pass them by, because they themselves haven't been correctly initiated. So you get
Yeah.
this competition going a lot of times. So an art form, this whole initiation ordeal, I think,
Hmm.
So
Yeah, something
that's,
that was coming up was like, it almost seems to me as if with this self-initiation process that we go through as a society, as a culture, that some people are never ripe because of like there's all this stuff coming up, and we didn't have the right initiation process growing up, that sometimes our culture doesn't ever get us to that point where we're ripe. And maybe it takes a lot of shadow work, or it takes a lot of deep psychological work to even get to that point where we would have a valuable initiation experience
and if
for some.
people are able to work on their shadow, that's a good thing. But a lot of times, what I see is there's in the consumer culture, there are so many choices to be made. Always, there's always something coming to you. Try this. You need a red car now, or you need a bigger car, and then you need a smaller car. Smaller cars. There's always something else, in the consumer culture to attract you to that. If I had this next thing, or if I did this next workshop even, or, that everything will be okay. There's always something, just, to more to get. And it gets to be kind of like it serves the consumer culture, because that's what it's there for. If it keeps giving you derivatives, it could go on endlessly because a derivative is never going to be totally fulfilling. I think one of the things is about this fulfillment is that you're going forward, but there's also got to be a backward motion, a regrounding that happens at the same time. And that isn't ever emphasized or acknowledged, that there's a grounding, a backward movement, and you've got to go both directions. If you just think of it as you're in the center of a sphere, and you're just moving forward, it's a linear movement. But if you're moving forward and grounding and backwards and remembering, it's a spherical kind of thing. You're growing the sphere then, and it's a different kind of a thing to be able to move multidimensionally instead of just in one direction. I think the culture wants you to go one direction, go forward,
Yeah.
But really, the thing is about expanding, and to expand in a complete way, you've got to be able to go down, you got to be able to go sideways, you got to be able to go backwards and forward. It's kind of like a spherical, sense, and most of us don't have a sense of ourselves as being anything but linear, on a linear trajectory, from present to future. Backward is like let it be, it's bygones, you can't change the past, is the thing that's said, which is not true. You change every time you think of a memory, you're reconstructing it fresh, along remnants of what you can remember. So things are very, very flexible, very permeable. So it's about being able to move multi-directionally, and that it's back grounded in the body. You know what I mean? You got to feel what that is physically, almost, to be able to be, in the body, and then expand from that. I've got a little meditation that I found works nice. I ask people, I go, how many directions are there? And should I give it to you? Do it here? Maybe we
Let's
can
do
finish
it.
up our. But what are the 10 directions? Well, you've got north, south, east, and west, and that's horizontal. That's around the earth. Okay. If you extend any of those 4 directions, it's curved, and it'll turn into its opposite. Just as an interesting little piece of info. Okay. So you've got 4 directions, and you've got what's called up and down. Okay, upward and downward.
Okay.
In the time space thing, if you extend upward totally, it'll come back and hit you in the ass. It becomes the bottom, right? So those are curved, also as well. So up and down, you got 6 directions, and then you have 4 more directions. 2 of them are inward and outward. You can reflect, okay, and you could also look outward. Most of the time, our senses are turned outward,
Absolutely.
We're viewing the world external. So there's internal and external. Those are directionalities. When you close your eyes and go inward, in the medicine, a whole dimension opens up. You go into the dream world without medicine. You can, when you go to sleep. Okay, so you got inward and outward. That's 8 directions. There's 2 more directions. One direction, and it has to do with the element of time, is the past, and it's reconstructed endlessly. And the other direction is the future, the teleological intentionality, moving forward in time, and being able to intuit things, from the future horizon of your trajectory that you're on. That's information coming to you, like what's around the corner as you're moving in this direction, and that's an intuition and part of the imagination, the forward and the backward, and the inward and the outward are also part of imaginal directions. So you've got physical directionality, you've got mental cognitive directionality, and you've got imaginal directionality. Those make up, those 10 directions give you a sense of being in the center of a spherical universe, basically. And everybody has that same capacity. When you imagine those 10 directions simultaneously, and you do a little medicine work, and you realize that you can expand or contract, given that that's the vessel, or what they call the athanor, that you need for the journey, for journeying into the other spaces, other realms. You have to first get grounded in those 10 directions and be able to imagine them at once. Then you've got a vessel to use, or an athanor to travel with, and that's what preparation did. Before they would initiate people, they would prepare them by helping them to build this vessel so that they had a vehicle to travel with, so that they could make meaning out of the experience. Is this coming from the future, what I'm getting as information? Is it something from my past? Is it something horizontal from the world that I'm living in, the horizontal world that's coming
Yeah.
in? And you start to be able to empower yourself to read the information as it's coming in. If you don't prepare, it could be very chaotic, the interpreting of the meaning from another realm, of experience from an expanded state of consciousness. So they would always, a good way to look at it is what the Eleusinian Mystery School did. They used to invite people to do one journey in the fall of every year. And they used to use they came to look at, it was probably an ergot that they were able to make that was stable enough that they could give it to everybody and know it would be okay, not poison them, not be too much, they'd be able to make this. But they would do a 6-month workshop in the spring prior to the journey being done in the fall. Everybody had to attend the workshop to be able to go do the mystery school experience in the fall. But it was 6 months of preparation. That preparation involved exercising, fasting, cleansing, strengthening the body, teachings that would explain some of the mythological entities that would be evoked, and that
Yeah.
would themselves to prepare that vessel so that, dancing was involved, celebration, which is part of ego transcendence, in this dimension, right?
Yeah.
But they were prepared, for the journey 6 months prior, so that when they did the experience, they would have that activated vessel. They'll be ready to go.
Mm.
That tradition lasted supposedly for 2,000 years until it was dismantled by the Romans and the Christians. They didn't like that.
Wow. Yeah, that's
They had a
fascinating stuff.
problem with that ritual experience. It's too experiential, It actually might have transformed people, So
Too
the
experiential.
hierarchy of the church and the Roman, leadership,
Yeah. Too experiential, yeah.